So that brings us to the final speaker of the day. Our final speaker of the day is somebody who's driven a lot of the industry side of thinking on platforms for quite some time now. And he's going to share with us the latest strain of where he's taking his thinking around platforms over the last few months. And he's JP Rangaswamy, the Chief Data Officer of Deutsche Bank. He was earlier the Chief Scientist at Salesforce. He's been on the board of the Computer History Museum as well. So we've got a bit of the board over here today. So JP is going to talk about a lot of his thoughts around where he's seeing the issues around platforms moving towards, and his new thinking in that direction. So it's less about his what he does on a daily basis and more about where he's thinking about this. So with that, I'd like to invite JP onto the stage.
Thank you, Sunil. So one of the challenges of being the last person to speak after 2 days for some of you and at least 1 day for the rest of you is how do I cover stuff that you haven't already heard? How do I keep you awake? How do I make up for being between you and drinks and whatever else? So forgive me if I take a sideways walk. I want to spend time trying to share my philosophy on platforms from two angles, the customer and data. And I was brought up to believe that the purpose of business is to create a customer. And whenever I want to think about platforms, if there isn't a customer, there is no platform to me. We can talk, design, structure, everything we want. Things begin and end with the customer. And what makes those customer interactions interesting is how, to me, and I'd say it because of my role, how data flows to get those interactions going. So I get fascinated by it. In fact, when I was listening to the last speaker, I sort of thought, some people may think a platform's a government, but I think more a platform's a city. And the idea of city-states and how they operate are much more the way my thoughts about platforms are influenced. So with that, I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes sharing those views. I'm going to be around for drinks, so feel free to tell me what you thought and why you disagreed with everything I've said. Okay, when I started looking at platforms, like most of you, the first thing I was told to look at was credit cards. The classic Schmallen, C. and Evans sort of thinking, the first platform of scale, the first place to look at where you cut your teeth was looking at the credit card industry. And it quite shocked me to know that the term credit card and what it was meant to do actually dated back 70, 80 years before we had credit cards. So I had to think about what it was that made that interesting, and it boiled down in a way to saying, today for me a credit card is just a bunch of numbers that I remember and I can quote at will in order to get a transaction done. It's nothing more than a sequence of numbers, but underpinning that sequence of numbers is a token to tell people who I am and some rights associated with it, a set of interoperability standards as to how to make that work. And, it feels like there is so much friction taken out of how a human being interacts, the messaging that is possible just by saying, I take 16 numbers and then add a few numbers. And today it's numbers. Tomorrow it doesn't even have to be numbers. But the underlying evolution of the platform that the credit card represented has now manifested itself in just an incredibly generative messaging protocol. But that's over 100+ years, and it had to be built. And I suggest the people who really built it weren't the people who had the credit card infrastructure. Everyone was responding to customer needs. We may have solved many, many things, but While we've had Moore's law and Metcalfe's law, we haven't really solved human longevity. So simplicity and convenience are still relatively important. And the things that I can do because of the evolution of the platform they call the credit card, prepay, post-pay, slice and dice, create a series of layers in the industry, allow myself to operate anywhere in the world, anytime in the world. The nature of how I permission things, the nature of how I move things around, right? It became messaging for a whole series of transactions in a way that would have been nigh impossible unless there was an evolution that took place over time about a friction at a time, a piece of latency at a time, where volume was thrown at it by human beings, and then it evolved to something that's there today. And the mobile phone industry or the car industry, depending on whether you think, a car is a mobile phone on wheels or a mobile phone is a car without wheels, I don't particularly care. But the premise is that these sets of standards, the protocols, the interactions, the messaging, all came because people wanted to do something, and the nature of what had to be done required standards and protocols to underpin the capacity to be generative, the inventiveness that took place. A few days ago I was reading about a village in northeastern Africa where they were trying to solve the problem of how to give bottled water to people because the quality of water was very hard. It was a village where some time ago people had put in ATMs, but there weren't enough people having bank accounts to make the ATMs useful. So the ATM had sort of decayed. And what was jerry-rigged into the place was someone using a mobile phone to send a message to the ATM to release a bottle of water. So you were drawing water, not from a well, but from an ATM. But the premise behind that was that necessity and this mother of invention bit takes place because of the sheer power of the customer. But what we have to see underpinning all that is the number of things that had to be done about standardization and sharing of the data before that became possible. And every time you speak about platforms, one of the things I start looking at is what were those standards and protocols that had to be obtained in order for human beings to have the freedoms of creativity that they would have had. Not long after the credit card kind of industry, and something that continues to today, is the idea that a platform attracts transactions, attracts people, attracts developers, attracts products. It's a whole sort of the ecosystem that is a virtuous circle and all that. But again, saying why does this attraction take place? And I remember when people were asking about Amazon as a platform, saying, look at the innovation that took place in the idea of one click and whether it should be allowed to have been patented and whatever else. But at the end of the day, what that represented was human beings who had no trust in this woo-woo land called the web to say we were going to share details of credit cards that were then going to go somewhere you didn't know and be stolen by people you didn't sort of even realize existed. That stopped because suddenly the freedom of saying, I can do this once and I don't have to keep taking that risk, meant that the trigger to an explosion of activity was the trust transformation that took place for the human being. Again, this was something that needed a lot of work underpinning it in terms of standards and protocols, a lot of work underpinning it to be able to bring third parties into play, to create trusted domains that were almost sort of nested. But it began from saying no one was going to shop anywhere if they didn't have some token to be able to come to the platform. And those tokens didn't exist with any kind of sort of volume until someone come along and said, you know what, I'll make it easy for you to do this. I'm going to take that fear away from you. So again, we can build all the platforms we want, but if we don't build them with an idea of saying you don't just make it easy, but you make it trustable in a way that prior inhibitions, prior fears are taken away, and that's part of what you concentrate on. Because it's still, whether you look at Amazon, eBay, Facebook, Google, anyone can build a search engine, but you can't build the history of all those terms as quickly. Anyone can build a bookstore, but you can't get millions, hundreds of millions of reviews over time. Anyone can build an auction house, but you can't get the ratings. Right? What makes all these things different is what we leave behind as customers. And the value that comes back to us is quite often what we leave behind as customers. It's that which creates the value in the most interesting platforms to me. Right? We are the providers of the value that then gets sent back to us in ways. Some of the people think platforms are exchanges. And a lot of activity then comes along into saying, well, what is a multi-sided exchange? How does value transfer to each other? But once again, I mean, and again, when you heard the last couple of sets of speeches, understanding the role of regulation becomes important when you see the power of the exchange to become very large. I was very taken with Robin Chase's recent book, sort of Peers Incorporated, because the idea that incumbents and startups were not in polarized conflict with each other, but instead there was a possibility of a partnership, that there are some institutions that are good at building, enabling infrastructure. There are some institutions that are good at being able to capture value at the edge and to be able to make that inventory shareable. Whenever I look at all these sort of inventory models, I remember the first one I really got excited by was the idea of, I can't even remember the name they originally came by, but the premise that they came along and said, one group of people parked cars at an airport, got on a plane and flew, and met in passing another group of people who had parked cars and flew to get to the other side, and they both rented cars. If we could find a way of netting the cars that were parked on the other side, there was a business to be had. So many of the exchange type principles, and we see many of today's business models looking through that, are about saying standardize inventory, make that inventory discoverable, make it exchangeable in a form where value is correctly ascribed across the value chain, even though it's in a network. And it has all the network effects of saying the more people that's there, the greater the inventory, the ability to be able to find what you want is easier, you get the granularity of the exchange. So it's a market with liquidity. But then suddenly you have to think about how you onboard things and how you offboard things and how you make it easy for someone to expose inventory, how you make it easy for someone to discover inventory. And when you do that, again, it's going to go back to who the person is, because we try to solve many things without thinking about the human aspect. I must have been in my early 20s when I was told, ATMs, and I'm just taking two examples of ATMs. They're not platforms, but they're to do with the usability implications that then affect every platform we build. First thing I was told was to avoid the risk of people stealing money through any form of cloning or identity theft. We're going to have biometric identification at ATMs. People were going to put their eyeball against a slit that there was going to have a laser running through. Okay, I said, yeah, this is what people are going to do in order to draw some money. Stick their eye into a hole in the wall and have a laser run through it, okay? Well, it didn't fly. But what was even worse was then saying, we're going to get people to settle their bills at an ATM. So now what you're going to do is it's Saturday evening, it's raining, you're in a queue, and the guy in front of you is using that time to settle his bills. Okay? There wasn't any, the intuition to say what a human being wants within the platform, which is the core of what drives the platform, was just missing. And this is as true in traditional product cycles as we've started seeing in platforms. When we see failures of platforms, it starts getting worrying if you see how much we design, how much we deal with it without actually once mentioning the word customer. Okay? I see the word user sometimes. I see the phrase use cases sometimes. Right? There are parts of the world I can't go to without fear of being killed if I use those terms. My favorite example of how platforms evolve is actually an airport. Okay? It starts off with a very, very simple premise. Planes land and planes take off. And then before you know it, it becomes a terminal that you can live in. And all the way in between, you have some things that are directly owned by the operator. Scale and scope, like are you going to have many airlines, many planes? Suddenly you need to think about standardizing, because standards and protocols happen in order to manage scale, right? If you don't have international flights, you don't need to have any idea of having passport control or customs, right? Functions start evolving, but it's effectively these things evolve from seed. And if you don't understand what the core purpose is, right, the center in Christopher Alexander terms of that city that you're building, then you don't know what else you're building. And when you realize that you're not actually the builder, you're a facilitator, and it's your customer that's doing the building, and it's at that point you really begin to start building platforms, right? When you put the customer in control of the platform to be able to do it. But from a, if you go back to the regulatory perspective, control in a way that the customer is protected, made safe, right? The harms that could take place, the asymmetries, the imbalances, that's part of the job to say, like going back to Amazon, I could part with my money and know, regardless of where the vendor was, I'm going to get either the goods or get paid back, okay? Those sort of guarantees are what make some of these platforms work, and that's part of what allows city-states to emerge, society to emerge, because there's a mutualization, a contract of trust between people. And it's those things that define what a platform is when you scale it. While I'm fascinated by platforms and the airport construct for it, I'm also confused, because I was in school when I was told that American Airlines was now worth less than Sabre, right? That I had to get used to the idea that there was an industry that standardized a whole lot of what it said, that actually said, every place name, every airport will have a standardized code, every airline will have it, codified what the routes were, codified the legs, codified the actual flights, created a virtual currency to be able to interact with each other, did all the standards and protocols work to be able to interoperate, exposed it all to build a travel industry around it, which became a travel and leisure and entertainment industry. So the John Deere tractor was there for the airline in the 70s. And then, bupkis, nothing. Why would that happen? Well, even regulation can have its less than good side. So if every airline was being protected in different forms so that the natural evolution of those interactions wasn't allowed to take place, then you'll end up being able to make statements like, in no year has Sigma Airlines made money, okay? Because we have created new frictions through regulation. And that's some of the risks that we take place when we build platforms. Now, everyone's spoken about a lot of these, and I'll put $1 into the Uber pot as well. But the premise I like is how wrong that statement is to me, saying someone was trying to assert that all these platforms have no assets, okay? That there is an over-the-topness of them, that they can extract value from somebody else's infrastructure and steal the margin that would otherwise operate. That's common parlance. And I'm turning around and saying, absolutely not. Right? There is one customer, and that customer is an asset. There are millions of customers, the customers are assets. But the customers aren't owned by the company. It is that partnership of the capabilities that you have as an institution and the relationships that you have with customers that create the value. And the value is both created and often owned by the customers. Right? We heard about some of the power of Kodak and people like Polaroid, and I was always taken with the fact that these two institutions, dominant market leaders, had the smartest brains in town, had patents up the wazoo, and then went to Chapter 11 hell in the same quarter that somebody paid the $1 billion for Instagram. So how come a company of 15 people whose job it was to make Kodak look like Polaroid was worth that much? And the only answer that's possible is they understood their customer, the others cared about their product, right? Switching to understand the customer focusing on the customer. It doesn't matter what you have to say about platforms. If it doesn't begin with the customer and doesn't end with the customer, I don't know what you have and I can't help you. I was born in Calcutta, and this is one of my favorite places to learn about madness, okay? That is Writers' Building. Probably, the British invented bureaucracy, exported it to India, the Indians made it a fine art. Okay? A quick aside, have I got a few minutes? Okay, a quick aside, in the mid-1970s, a Prime Minister of India decided to declare central and many states dry. And an industry was formed in one of the states to say dry doesn't work, so you need foreigners to have an exemption in order to get hard currency. That was the rule. Then suddenly it became, if you have a medical condition that required the use of alcohol, then you will got one. And permit offices were built. And these were big business because you needed lots of permits for lots of people with these medical conditions requiring alcohol. Then the government changed, and we had a labor problem because the new guy wanted to remove the prohibition. But what do you do with all these permit offices? And apparently the answer that came, and I have no reason to believe it's not true, was to say, right, we can't have that, we can't shut these down. So from tomorrow, everybody can drink, but everybody needs a permit. Okay? And the reason I say it is that is the art of bureaucracy as an extreme. But the reason I put that up is one facet of platforms, which I think is worth everyone in this room considering when it comes to human beings. When correctly governed, platforms are a source and control for diversity. Okay? When built right, the power of a platform to be able to heterogenize rather than homogenize is great. And when designing platforms, if you really think about the people, you will start thinking hard about the power of the platform to act as a vehicle for diversity. Okay? It's non-trivial. Right? When I look at how the ecosystem of sort of the civil service forms in countries like India after the British left and how it evolved and continued, one of the things was you couldn't game that system. Right? You had people being circulated around the country, doing terms in one location and another. There was enough pressure for people to join to say that you'd got a diversity of the input. The location diversity came along. It was one where you couldn't keep the gender sort of barriers in place either because of the sheer scale of these things. And more and more when I see things about inclusion and exclusion, I start looking at how the right design of a platform can have immense socio-economic effects on being able to have the right views on diversity. This is one of my favorite cities, it's Bologna. And the reason why I bring Bologna up in a discussion about platforms is going back to this idea of cities. As I said, I'm very taken by people like Christopher Alexander and Jane Jacobs and how they made architecture of these places living things with power being given to the people who abode there, who inhabited that place. And you have to understand what that actually means in creative terms. I have never driven in my life. So at one extreme in my life is LA, where I don't know how people live there if they don't have a car and don't know how to drive because I couldn't even find sidewalks in some parts of the place. And in Bologna, you have 31 kilometers of portico. Right? I could go from place to place just walking, choosing whether I want the sunny side of the street or whether I want shade, having protection when I want covered and still being able to have the open air rather than enclosed in glass. Right? When we build platforms, we have to build platforms that are going to last. Like, this is what's left of Mohenjo-Daro. But what settlements like these mean to me whenever I look at archaeological places is, well, they were platforms. Every city is a platform. It grew for a particular reason. It attracted people for particular reasons. There might have been external effects that changed all that, whether it's volcanoes or invasions or whatever. But for these things to work, you had entry and exit, you had communal places, you had to think about how traffic flows around it. So you had to understand the onboarding and offboarding. You had to understand information flow. You had to understand management of waste and sanitation. You had to understand housekeeping, right? It's all these things that make the platform, rather than the business model and what you're going to capture and how you're going to deal with your shareholder value, right? The platform is about the people, and the people need to have all these tools: entry, exit, participation, community interaction, how they feel safe, why they feel safe, what they feel safe about. So whenever I want to think about this, whenever I try to construct platforms, I come back to the data, because data is what flows through these, whether it's the roads and the streets, whether the highways or the byways, and for that matter, the sewers. Because you also have to extract waste out of the data. You have to curate that data. It just doesn't happen by itself. So I know you've had a long day. I'm going to come to a stop now. The phrase that used to resonate even before Hillary Clinton used it, about it takes a village to teach a child, I think it takes a city to teach us how to build platforms. Thank you for your time.